have the lovely and talented violinist Joanna Lee. Joanne, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself? And yeah.
Yes, of course. So at the moment, I am finishing up my doctoral studies at the UBC School of Music. I am actually a DMA candidate, and I'm also teaching on the side, and I have a few projects going on, including being part of the Artemis Musician Society, and I also freelance.
Oh, very cool. Yes. Um, so we were talking the other day about musicality, and I thought that would be like a really good subject to kind of talk about. So I think because I think musicality can sometimes mean different things to different people. So how would you, as a musician, define musicality in playing music? That is.
How would I define musicality? That's a very good question. I would say honing your personal style that really plays a huge role in how you make music and how you interpret it and how you present yourself.
Cool. Yeah, I really like that idea of finding your own personal style because I think sometimes as musicians and it doesn't really matter what your level is. It's kind of sometimes people get the idea it's like, oh, you have to play this particular way and that is what musicality is. And I think I know for myself that was something that I always struggled with because I was like, well, I can't make myself sound like exactly like other people. So I always really yeah, I always really struggled with it. So I really like that definition. When you're working with students, when do you think that sort of this approach of finding your own sort of sound start? Is this something that right from the beginning? Is there like it's too soon, or does it take away from learning the foundations? Like how do you approach this in your teaching?
Well, I think it's contingent on how ready the student is. They have to be accepting of themselves, and that when you start an instrument, it's not going to be easy. You're going to have to struggle through your journey. And I would say exposure is key. So, exposing them to professional recordings, concerts, live concerts, anything you can practically get your hands on. And with the internet, everything is super resourceful. So, you can find things
Hmm.
on YouTube, or you can go on Naxos website and listen to all the old recordings. And I'm pretty positive about introducing the past as well as the present so that they can make an informative decision for themselves to
Hmm.
know which style they feel is suitable to their level.
Yeah. That's something interesting. How much do you like with you when you're working with students? Do you do you do this in within the lesson, or is it something that's sort of like expected, like you send it to them for on own? Because I know myself with teaching that sometimes parents get a little bit nervous. Oh, you're not actually teaching right now. You're playing video. So how do you handle that situation?
I would say it's contingent on how long the lesson is and
Mm.
if they have any questions and if they are proactive in doing things by themselves, then yes, of course I would assign it. But if they're
Hmm.
not as proactive, I would introduce, a tidbit and say, the assignment is for you to go home and watch the rest of this because we can't spend the whole lesson
Yeah.
watching
Yeah.
concerto or watching a small piece because it can take anywhere up to 5 minutes to about half an hour or even
Hmm.
more, right?
Yeah. 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 Cool. Cool. Um. Yeah, that's yeah. I know. I sometimes like it's sometimes it's like will they actually listen to this on their own and trying to kind of play that balance, yeah, and making sure that everything else is covered. Do you? So one thing that I've noticed, really, as I kind of become older and I guess maturing. Well, not really, but like to pretend that I'm maturing as an educator that I noticed that really learning styles and of course personalities too really play a huge part in students' developments. And I noticed that like some kids it's like if they find it harder, they might be really sensitive and really creative kids, but they find really hard time sort of taking that creative and that all of that and putting it into their playing. um, so how do you sort of approach different styles of learning or different personality types, and how do you help them sort of discover musicality? Yeah.
Well, I have a long chat with them about what their personality is like, talk to their parents, whether it's an adult student or a young child. I would say talk to the adult first to learn what their personality is like and what
Mm-hmm.
their attention span is like. You have to keep it interesting. You can't teach the same way for everyone. Everyone has different styles and personality, and learning style and learning curve is part of the whole process of actually teaching, getting to know your student the way they are inside the classroom, outside the classroom, and how they work. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
a really key factor in
Yeah.
defining what their personality is like.
Yeah. Do you find, especially when as they get younger, how much do you find that parents' involvement is that a huge part of it? Do you find in your own teaching?
Well, I do in a way, but I also find that it depends. Like I say, if it's someone who's absolutely responsible and who's capable of doing things on their own with very little help, of course, I would say, don't get too involved. But if it's someone who, has trouble focusing, I would say, have the parent bring in positive reinforcement. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think punishment is the key
No.
factor. Yeah, I don't think you should force your child or student to learn the instrument. I think if it's not right for them, then immediately recognize that and,
Mm-hmm.
cut your losses. But
Yeah.
if you find that they absolutely enjoy it, and I don't know, someone with a learning disability such as ADD or ADHD, they'll have to take Ritalin or some sort of medication to keep their focus. And with
Mm-hmm.
children like that, I would say keep it interesting,
Mm-hmm.
but don't make it too strenuous and don't make it too long and don't make it too detailed. Keep it simple as possible so that they can go on to basic steps. I think
Mm-hmm.
when you throw too much material out there, it really has an effect on how the child progresses or the student progresses, and you absolutely just have to get to know your student. That's the key factor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think yeah, getting to know their personality. Yeah, I've been noticing that less is especially as we're working a lot on the internet. Less is more for sure. And actually, our first episode, Marion and I were discussing that as well. And then also, what I've been actually discovering, especially because I'm teaching online, that sometimes if they have an hour lesson in the week, breaking that up into two half an hour segments, and I'm finding that like we're covering so much more material, and it's just because they can just focus on like a couple little things. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, especially my students, I find that might have atypical brains, or they it really helps them. So talking about limitations, I mean, I think doesn't we all have limitations as humans, and some are more visible, obviously, than others. How do you work around a student's limitations in understanding musicality, or just understanding, basics of how to play their instrument? Yeah.
Well, I would say auditory is very important. It's
Mm-hmm.
significant in knowing what type of sound you want to produce. And, you ask all sorts of questions, just be the detective and, what they liked about the performance and what they didn't like. And I think that if you say one pedagogical approach is more superior to the other, it doesn't work that way. I don't
Mm-hmm.
believe in that because you don't often produce a well-rounded student. You have a very prejudiced student against certain pedagogical methods. And I believe that's wrong in a sense. I believe that you should introduce them to as many pedagogical methods as possible, just
Mm-hmm.
so that they can discover what they like.
Mm-hmm. So, so with your students, like, what sort of pedagogical, I guess, methods do you find really sort of useful? Say you're working with someone with ADHD. What kind of methods have you found really work beneficial?
Well, it depends if you are talking musically or technically. So
Mm-hmm. Or both.
yeah, absolutely. What I find about the Royal Conservatory School of Music, that whole method I find is great in the sense that you get a lot of students learning a variety of pieces, right? Not just variety of pieces, but the basic technical elements that actually bring a lot into practice. I think that teaches a lot of discipline, but
Mm-hmm.
not only, introducing that, I think there are a lot of good elements in Suzuki in which you learn how to do ear training really well. But I would not implement that method alone. I would start out with string builder because, or as a string player, because I feel that A, they have to learn the notes. B, they have to recognize what the notes sound like and how the placement is on the
Yeah, especially for violin, right? I mean, us
yes,
pianists are a
absolutely.
little spoiled.
Well, it is one of the most difficult instruments out there.
Yeah.
So I would say that that's a key factor in really getting the basics down and then introducing the style, but also slowly introducing the style while you teach the technical elements by
Mm-hmm.
exposing them at an early age what the violin could sound like, what the violin, what kind of voice you can produce with a violin. So
Mm-hmm.
also implementing the idea that you're supposed to imitate the voice, that's absolutely important. And
Mm-hmm.
I would say introduce them to opera at a younger age and choral singing. I think Orff is great for that because
Yes, Orph is wonderful. Yeah.
yes. So it produces a lot of musical elements in the sense that they can interpret what's on the page more easily. I would
Yeah.
say it's more accessible.
Yeah, that's interesting. How, as violinist, you're thinking of the human voice, but I'm. It's quite funny because when I'm teaching voice or in piano too, I'm getting my students to listen to violinists, and I'm like, listen to the violin, listen how the sound makes, and so I find sometimes it's easier for them to find sense of musicality through listening to violin. So it always fascinates me how all these things are just connected and they fit together. Oh yeah. Um, just for the people that are watching that are not violinists, tell me a little bit about. It's called Note Builder. You were saying this
String
method.
builder,
Oh,
yeah.
String Builder. How, what kind of like how do they approach reading and all that?
So they use measurements, and the measurements are approximate because it really depends on the size of your violin. And, they start off with learning longer notes and making sure that the student understands the basic quarter note, half note, and whole note.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, they introduce the first finger on the A string and then the first finger on the D string, G string, and you learn how to place the notes with measurements. And
Mm.
I guess they use the law of physics to do that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to, it's like building frets, that invisible fret on your
Okay.
violin, except you put
Yeah.
tape
Is
on
Yeah,
and
I was gonna ask if
yeah.
it's because I always remember I taught at a music store and everyone had white tape, little white tape on their violins, and I'm like, oh, what's that for?
Yeah. But I would
Yeah.
say that only goes so far. It sort of acts as a crutch. So you have to basically get wean them off. It's like taking them off of training wheels, essentially. And I really like this method because Samuel Applebaum was the creator of this method. I
Mm.
found that not only did he have a knowledge of how to teach the violin in the beginner stage, he understood the difficulty behind the instrument. It makes it more accessible when it's more
Mm.
scientifically instructional, but it doesn't make it necessarily musical, I would say. So that's where you would have to come in and, you know, yeah,
Yeah.
implement the style.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's cool. Yeah, it's interesting talking about crutches because I think students will develop like there's like in singing, for example, sometimes reaching high notes, students will bend their knees and it always makes me laugh. You know, I would go to festival and I would see little like these little knee bends in students, and I'd be like, "Oh, it's a crutch now." Yeah, it almost it's tricky because sometimes the crutch can take away, well, visually takes away from a student's learning, but it also it's they can express themselves, and so yeah, it's finding that using a sort of item or whatever to help them find a musicality or find thing, and but then where do you take it away? Yeah, this morning I had a little one. She was a little frustrated because her crutch. I was trying to take her crutch away, and she was getting mad at herself. It was, yeah, it was very cute. Yeah.
Well, that goes without saying. You know that proverb, if you teach a boy how to fish, he will feed the world. But if you give him a fish, he'll eat for a day. And, you just don't want that. You don't want your student to essentially survive just for the day. You want them to have a lifelong skill. And that's what you're essentially teaching as teachers.
Yes. Oh yeah, that's so important. I always remember when I was in high school, my dad was working with this other gentleman, and he was like, "Oh yeah, my daughter plays, piano, blah blah blah." And he goes, "Oh, my wife plays piano." And he's like, "Oh, that's nice. How long she been playing?" And I think it was like 20 years or something.
Oh, wow.
And this poor lady, every time she wanted to learn a piece, she would go to her teacher, and her teacher would teach that particular piece. So my dad came home, and I just started like as a student teacher, and he told me that story, and it's always stuck in my head. And I was like, just like that saying, right? Like I want to eliminate me. And I tell my students, I'm like, I am trying to eliminate me. I want you not to need me. And they're like, no. And I'm like, no, no. There will come a day that you don't need me. And I think that's our job as teachers, is to really help them to be able to do all these things on their own without us. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
the time that you've succeeded as a teacher is when they've moved on from you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure. Yeah. 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 So just talking about, because one thing that I'm really focused on in my studio is really trying to create a holistic sort of approach, making sure that all sort of development is possible, and and I see the benefit, and I'm sure you do too. But how do you find this sort of approach of creating this sort of holistic approach, and how? Yeah, tell us a little bit how you do it, and then how that benefits the students in the long run.
Well, I wouldn't say my approach is necessarily holistic.
Oh, okay.
I do use traditional elements in it because that was what worked for me. And I do believe that in a sense you do need discipline. You need to implement that as a teacher.
Hmm.
You have to be a leader in that, though. If you do it in a abusive way, obviously it's not going to work, or negative. Everything has to be a positive influence. Even if a student comes in one day and says, I just did not have the time to play, you have to be a little more understanding. But at the same time, you can only let it go once. If they come up with that excuse every single time, then you just have to put your foot down and say, look, I know you can do better, so please try harder, because you're smarter than that, right? You can't just let them get away with it every single time. Of course, then what would be the purpose of you being their teacher?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because obviously, I mean, if they're continuously not being prepared, it's either mommy and daddy forcing them, or they really, if
Yeah.
they're not, if they're old enough, they're obviously not. It's not a priority, right? And so they need to sort of make a decision. Is this a priority or not? Yeah, yeah. I always remember. Um, I was volunteering at a youth camp, and there was a little situation with the kids, um, and one of the organizers said to me, he goes, "Sometimes it's okay to be the bad guy," because I kind of looked like the bad leader at that moment. It was all the kids were mad at me, right? And he's like, "No, it's okay. It's okay to be the bad guy sometimes." Yeah. So I think that's true. Something also really important to remember is sometimes you do need to like be strict with kids, right? Because if you're always like nice, you're actually not really being nice, really, right?
Yeah, and nice isn't necessarily kind, right? You
Hmm.
can be kind about how you discipline your student or your child or anybody in regard to that matter. But if you use, like I said, negative or abusive connotations, then it doesn't send out a positive message, and it can also psychologically damage or scar the student.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. No, I'm sure you've met adults, and they say, "Oh, yeah, I played violin or piano when I was a kid, but my teacher was mean, so I quit, right? And
Yes.
I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. Like, yeah, I always somehow like feel like I need to like make up for that teacher. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Actually, that's a good question. How would you, because it can be really traumatic. I mean, I've had teachers and it took me years to kind of deal with the trauma they left me. But how would you deal with an adult, say, adult student who had learned as a child and did have a teacher that was sort of abusive and then they, struggled with playing and being musical at the piano?
Well, I would say all the positive things first, right? I would
Mm-hmm.
what they produced as far as music goes, and I would list all the positive things first. And then I would tell them, but, this could be better in such a way if you implemented this a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, if they were on the violin, if they were playing with shorter bows, but they could have used, which is common, the bottom half of their bow, I would say, look, if you have a really lovely sound, but you can optimize it more if you would use, your whole bow or different parts of your bow, and it's not producing the sound I know you could produce.
Mm-hmm.
So they would essentially work on it. Most people would, and they would come back, and it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But you would have to have that explanation there, not just say just do it, because that's a very old school way of saying, you know
I know. Yeah, do it this way. It's the right way, and that's it. No,
don't argue it.
yeah,
Yeah, I don't
exactly. No
believe in that.
argument.
I believe that's pretty negative, because you're not, a child is curious, a student is curious, a human being is just a curious being, right? You
Hmm.
can't just not explain it and let it go and just say, because I said so. That's not right.
I'm sure you got that answer too. I know I got that answer when I was like, why? Because I
Yes.
said so. Yeah, I think sometimes I like we laugh, but the older teachers, I think it was partially because of the way that they taught, and it was often because it was sort of like it was like almost like a parent teaching a child, right? And so it was like
Yes.
generation to generation passed on this information, and there wasn't sort of the pedagogical idea behind the sort of, I mean, especially like I know myself for singing, there's a scientific, it's a scientific approach, we're studying the anatomy and the physiology of the human body, and understanding why it's better to sing. Even with piano, you gotta sit this way because you're not gonna hurt yourself, kind of thing. Whereas with the older generation, I feel like they weren't taught that information, and so I don't know if there was access to it, or it wasn't just something that you know people were taught. So we laugh, but it really wasn't their fault. I mean,
Yeah, and I would say there's a huge generation gap in lifestyle changes, right? Back then, nobody really knew that smoking was bad for you. Nobody knew that drinking was going to kill you quicker, right?
yeah,
But
quicker, yeah.
these days, people take a lot of measures into practicing physical health
Mm-hmm.
by exercising and, keeping a healthy lifestyle. And I think that really plays into the picture,
Mm-hmm.
especially mental health. I think that's one of the things all musicians struggle with. It doesn't matter whether you're an amateur or professional, there's always this psychological struggle, because being a musician is hard.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a great understanding of who you are as a person and how to deal with these challenges, I believe you could definitely overcome that. And
Mm-hmm.
that's where I feel the teacher should come into play, to know exactly how their student would react.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's very important. I remember when I first started teaching voice, it wasn't really brought up in when I was teaching just piano, but when I started teaching voice, one of the sort of senior voice teachers at my university said to me, she's like, "Are you taking psychology?" And I said, "Oh, well, I took the required one." She's like, "No, you need to take way more psychology class." And I was like, "Why?" And she's like, "You'll see. You need to really understand the human brain and mental health, and because she's like it's gonna come up in lessons, and you're gonna have to learn how to help those kids, right? And if you don't have those at least a basic understanding, yeah, they won't be able to learn music, let alone um just living life, right? So yeah, it's interesting our kind of role that we play. It's a little bit of everything.
Absolutely. And I was talking to a pianist, Sarah Ho, about
Hmm.
this the other day, and we were talking about how it's really important that we also recognize that we're always learning as teachers as well as performers. We learn better when we are able to understand our students and understand the music, and sometimes things come to us unexpectedly. We notice different musical changes on the page, which always has been present, right? You just notice it more because we're teaching it.
Yeah.
And I believe that is a really important factor to recognize that, you can't just throw out bowings because it's traditional. You can't throw out um, fingerings just because it's traditional. You have to recognize somebody's going to have longer arms, someone's going to have longer fingers, someone's going to have a shorter stature, and you're
Hmm.
going to have to adjust to that essentially. And
Yeah.
if you miss a shift, you're going to have to help them recover from that and find a better solution.
Yeah. Oh, that's so 100%. I know myself. In singing, I always struggled with breath support, and then I noticed that all my teachers were a lot taller than me. So breathing, like they naturally had bigger lungs than me, right? And so their their breath support is going to come easier to them. So yeah, like learning, yeah, it's understanding that, right, and seeing limitations. And yeah, it's funny mentioning about sheet music. You can stare at a sheet music for years, and then a kid plays it for you, and then suddenly you're like, oh yeah, it says that there, and I didn't do that when I learned that piece either.
Absolutely. And posture plays a big picture in instruments, right? Even
Hmm.
voice instrument, it doesn't matter when you have terrible posture and you're always playing in that same position. It's actually quite detrimental to your physical
Hmm.
health. And you have to go see, I don't know, medical practitioners just to fix a problem you could have avoided.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Have you taken any like Alexander technique, or have you looked into any of that?
I looked into the Feldenkrais technique and
Oh,
I
okay.
looked to Alexander. I believe the theory of it really works. I
Hmm.
believe body awareness technique is important, but I
Hmm.
also believe a lot of these things are also um, psychological. And I think when you understand where the anxiety comes from, when you understand how to be more solid as a person and to fight your inner demons and to ignore what the rest of the world is criticizing
Yes.
you about,
Yes.
then you're able to let go and really make music that's meaningful.
Yeah. Oh, that's so important. Yeah. Yeah. And I think too as well, like you're right, these things are important to kind of understand how they work, but also I think it's almost what we do outside of the studio as well. I know myself, I went through university not really working out because I was just so busy. And then later on, I just got into more in fitness and stuff like that. And then I started to notice that because I was in physically better shape, my back didn't hurt at the piano. My breast support was better. All these, it had trickled. So really, that's one thing I try to really encourage my students to, like, go exercise, right? Even if it's just going for a walk, anything, right? Because it will
Absolutely.
really benefit. Yeah.
I would even say take ballet because that really fixes your posture.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
Yes, I would say pretend there's a string hanging from the top of your head and that you really want to roll your shoulders back because that really produces great support and
Mm-hmm.
to work on your back strength. That's the foundation of it all, just posture
Mm-hmm.
in general.
Yeah. Yeah, and it will pay it off when they get to be old, because it's true.
Absolutely.
You go to the mall and you see, these poor seniors, and they're bent over so much, and I like just looking at them, it hurts. So I can't imagine the pain that they are, right?
Yeah,
So
and if not ballet, you can practice yoga, you can do Pilates, and I really implement and stress that that should be a lifestyle,
mm-hmm.
every day, you
Yeah.
know, regimen. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I would absolutely encourage my students to do is to be more aware of physical activity and how we do it and to learn the correct way in doing it, right? You can
Mm-hmm.
play tennis and play incorrectly and injure yourself all over again. Golf, the same thing. at the end of the day, you just have to really pick something that will help you strengthen your muscles.
Mm-hmm.
And also swimming is great, right?
Oh, swimming. Oh, I love swimming. I miss swimming.
Me too.
Oh, oh, the world. But yeah, no, yeah, no, yeah, and that's the thing too, right? Everyone's so different, so it's what might work for some person might not work for another person. So really, again, getting to know your student and really helping them kind of understand and explore and see what works for them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of my students used to do martial arts, right? Because of COVID, it was,
Yeah.
it had to stop. But they found the similarity in doing martial arts and also playing the violin. And I believe everything is relatable, especially in the physiology of everything.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool. Yeah. No, I actually, what I've noticed too, because I've had a lot of students over the years study martial arts, and because there's such a respect for discipline in that craft,
Yes,
it's not even really about fighting in a lot of ways. It's really just about self awareness and about self discipline. And so, um, I didn't really see the correlation other than for piano and voice, but rather just the discipline that students brought, and you would see it, like I remember I had a couple of kids, they didn't weren't doing martial arts. They started music first, and then later on they went, and that you would see the maturity and growth just happen because of yeah. I always want to go be a fly in a martial arts studio and see how they teach that, because it's really fascinating. Yeah, yeah,
absolutely, yes.
yeah, yeah. Cool, cool. So I think that's all I have. Is there anything you'd like to add, or yeah?
Well, I would say when learning a new instrument, always be kind to yourself, always be patient, and find a teacher who will share that patience with you, who will share the journey and who will be open to listening to your ideas, but also be open, no matter how old school or new school or modernized that person is. I believe it's important to essentially respect the teacher, being
Mm-hmm.
on both sides now.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's very true. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, research teachers. Go interview with multiple teachers, yeah, too. I think that's also important, right? Making sure your personalities
Absolutely. And trial
match.
lessons also helpful, right? They might be helpful in the sense that you'll get a grasp of what the teaching style is like. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it might not work out at the end of the day. Sometimes it might not fit your budget, but you have to be prepared that those are going to be the factors.
Yeah, yeah.
And you also have to be prepared to know that that person might work or might not work for you. It's a 50-50 chance.
Mm-hmm.
And you never know until you try.
Yeah. Yeah. You never know until you
Yeah.
try. Yeah.
And you will, as you advance, you might have disagreements with your teacher because you're just different people, essentially, right? But at the end of the day, they want what's best for you. Just trust that and work with it. And if it doesn't work out, then find another teacher.
Yes, yeah. But learning to trust, I think, yeah, that's so important too, because it's hard,
Yeah,
especially in our culture, which is, more me focused. Trusting another human is sometimes it's harder said than done. Yeah. Yes.
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This was awesome. And so where can people? Because I keep forgetting to do this in each one. How can people find you if they want to check out your music or your teaching? How can they find you?
Well, I do have a website. It's musicforseasons.com. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
Or yeah. I will actually send a link to you
Oh,
and
awesome. That's even
they
better.
can find me.
Yeah. I'll include it underneath.
Sounds great.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you again, and we'll talk soon.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Anytime. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.